And it ended up being one of the most enjoyable relationships I've ever had.
The screen fades from black. His voice echoes softly, calm, yet full of memory. At 89, Robert Redford speaks not as a legend, but as a man looking back on the women who shaped his life, the ones he loved, lost, and never forgot. To the world, he is the Sundance Kid, the golden man of Hollywood, a symbol of integrity and charm. But even legends carry private stories, some too tender, too personal to tell until time has softened them.
I saw her on a TV show, and I'd never seen her before, and I said, that's it. Whoever she is, I'm going to go with it. I'm going to take a chance.
That chance, that one impulsive decision, changed everything. Because for Redford, love was never calculated. It was instinct, emotion, and vulnerability hidden beneath quiet strength. Each woman he loved revealed a different side of him: the passionate artist, the restless dreamer, the wounded soul still chasing connection. Some were co-stars who blurred the line between fiction and reality. Others were lovers whose presence lingered long after the lights went out. And one, the woman who stood beside him in silence for years, witnessed the man behind the myth. When asked once about love, Redford paused for a long time before answering. "I've loved deeply, but not always wisely. The ones who stayed in my heart taught me the most." This isn't about scandal or gossip. It's about the truth of a man who lived, loved, and lost in front of the world's eyes, yet kept his most meaningful moments hidden in the quiet corners of his heart. At 89, Robert Redford decided to share them. 6 women who defined his life, each a reflection of who he was and who he became. "Love isn't about forever," he once said. "It's about the moments that stay with you, even when everything else fades." And so we begin. A journey through passion, heartbreak, and memory. The 6 women Robert Redford could never forget.
Lola Van Wagenen, the woman who believed before the world did. Long before the fame, the films, and the Sundance legend, there was Lola Van Wagenen. To the world, she may seem like a forgotten name, but to Robert Redford, she was the foundation, the woman who believed in him before anyone else did. They met in the late 1950s in Los Angeles, 2 young dreamers from completely different worlds. Redford was a struggling art student who had just dropped out of college, living on barely enough to eat, restless and uncertain. Lola, a bright, independent Mormon girl from Utah, carried a warmth that grounded him. She saw beyond the arrogance and uncertainty. She saw potential, a spark of something real. At a time when Redford was still running from his own demons, the loss of his father, his early arrests, his anger at authority, Lola saw through the facade. She believed in his talent when all he had was hope and sketches in a notebook. They married in 1958, long before the fame, long before Hollywood knew his name. The ceremony was quiet, no tuxedos, no champagne, just 2 young people who thought love could conquer anything. They were both barely in their 20s, broke and idealistic. But together, they built something steady. When Robert started acting in New York's theater scene, Lola worked odd jobs to support them. She typed scripts, cooked cheap meals, and raised their children while he traveled. In her quiet strength, he found stability, a home to return to when the lights went out. But fame changes everything. When Barefoot in the Park, 1967, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, 1969, turned him into a global star, the world around them exploded. Reporters camped outside their home. Fan letters poured in by the thousands. And Lola, who had once been the center of his world, now found herself in its shadow. Still, she stayed. Through the whirlwind of fame, the long absences, the gossip columns, they raised 4 children, built a ranch in Utah, and tried to keep life as normal as possible. But the gap between the private man and the public icon kept growing. Lola once said, "It's hard to share someone with the world." And Redford knew it too. He later admitted, "She gave me something I didn't deserve, her patience." In 1985, after 27 years of marriage, they quietly divorced. No scandal, no bitterness, just the quiet understanding that they had grown apart. She returned to academia, earning a PhD in history, and continued her work in education and social causes. Years later, Redford would look back and say, "Lola was there before the fame, before the noise. She was the one who believed when no one else did. I owe her more than anyone knows." Their love wasn't built for Hollywood. It was built for survival. And though it ended, it became the benchmark against which all his other relationships would be measured. For Robert Redford, Lola Van Wagenen wasn't the first chapter of his story. She was the reason there was a story at all. If Lola was the foundation, Natalie Wood was the spark. When Robert Redford first met her on the set of Inside Daisy Clover, 1965, he was still the quiet newcomer, the artist who had never quite felt he belonged in Hollywood. She, on the other hand, was already a star, radiant, confident, the very embodiment of the Hollywood dream. Natalie Wood had grown up on film sets. She was both dazzling and deeply fragile, a woman who had lived her life under the public gaze since childhood. Redford, shy and introspective, was her opposite in every way, but on screen and off, they found a connection that surprised them both. Their chemistry was undeniable. The camera loved them, 2 beautiful people caught between ambition and uncertainty. In Inside Daisy Clover, Natalie played a rising movie star whose life is destroyed by fame, and Redford played the charming yet distant man she falls for. What the audience didn't know was that their connection behind the scenes mirrored the very story they were acting out. Natalie saw in Redford something real, a grounded man untouched by the arrogance of Hollywood. He admired her intensity, her professionalism, her fire, but he also sensed her sadness, the kind that no makeup or spotlight could hide. They reunited 2 years later in This Property is Condemned, 1966, and by then their chemistry had become legendary. There was tenderness, tension, and something unspoken between them, the quiet ache of 2 souls who recognized each other, but knew they couldn't stay. Redford would later say, "With Natalie, I didn't have to act. Everything between us was just there." But he also knew that their worlds were too different. Natalie was married, trapped in the cycle of fame she couldn't escape. He was still chasing authenticity, trying to stay human in an industry that sold illusions. When she died tragically in 1981, Redford was devastated. He said nothing publicly for years, no interviews, no tributes. But when asked decades later, his voice softened. "She was one of the most genuine people I ever knew. She cared too much, felt too deeply, and I never forgot her." Natalie Wood wasn't just a co-star. She was the mirror that reflected Redford's own inner conflict, fame versus truth, illusion versus honesty. Their time together was brief, but it ignited something in him, a deeper understanding of art, emotion, and the cost of being vulnerable on screen. For Robert Redford, Natalie Wood was not the love that stayed, but she was the one who reminded him why he fell in love with storytelling in the first place.
If Natalie Wood brought out Robert Redford's tenderness, Jane Fonda brought out his fire. They were 2 of Hollywood's brightest stars, brilliant, opinionated, and utterly different, yet somehow drawn together by a shared restlessness. They first met on the set of The Chase, 1966, a film that mirrored the turbulence of the decade. The 1960s were changing America, politics, culture, love, and both Redford and Fonda were part of that revolution. He was the quiet rebel, She was the outspoken activist. Together, they created a chemistry that could not be scripted. Redford admired Jane's intensity, her courage to speak her mind, to question everything. She admired his steadiness, his refusal to bend to Hollywood's games. He once said of her, "Jane had this rare mix of vulnerability and strength. She made me nervous, in a good way." Their professional relationship evolved into something deeper. Not quite romance, not quite friendship, but something in between. They challenged each other on set, in politics, in life. Jane once admitted, "Bob and I were like magnets. We'd clash, we'd pull apart, but we couldn't stay away." In Barefoot in the Park, 1967, they played newlyweds discovering the beauty and chaos of love. Audiences fell in love with them. The perfect balance of energy and restraint, passion and humor. The film turned them into one of cinema's most beloved pairs. Off-screen, the spark continued. They spent hours talking about art, social change, and the kind of movies that mattered. But both were married, both guarded, and both carried too much pride to cross that invisible line. Years later, they reunited for The Electric Horseman, 1979, and again, the magic returned. This time, they weren't the carefree lovers of the 60s. They were older, wiser, and more fragile. The film mirrored their own reality, two people searching for authenticity in a world that had lost it. Fonda said, "Bob never flirted, but he always made me feel seen, and that's rarer than love." And Redford years later confessed, "Jane was the kind of woman who scared me a little, because she made me want to be better." They would work together one last time in Our Souls at Night, 2017, a quiet, tender film about two lonely hearts finding comfort in each other late in life. It felt less like acting and more like closure, a cinematic full circle 50 years in the making. When asked what she loved most about him, Jane smiled and said, "He's never been afraid of my fire. He just knew how to cool it." For Robert Redford, Jane Fonda was not a lost love. She was a mirror, a rival, a lifelong companion in the art of truth. Their connection was not about passion, but about mutual understanding. Two artists bound by time, fire, and respect.
If Jane Fonda challenged Robert Redford, Barbra Streisand disarmed him. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, bold, witty, fiercely talented, and unapologetically herself. When they first came together on the set of The Way We Were, 1973, sparks flew, both on-screen and off. The movie told the story of two people from opposite worlds. Katie, the outspoken political idealist, and Hubble, the quiet, all-American writer who hides behind charm. But for Redford and Streisand, the line between character and reality blurred. She was loud where he was quiet, passionate where he was reserved. Their chemistry was lightning, unpredictable, unstoppable, unforgettable. Director Sidney Pollack once said, "Barbra and Bob were magic together, but it was combustible magic." There were arguments on set, creative clashes, power struggles, moments of frustration. Barbra wanted perfection. Redford wanted honesty. Yet somehow, their differences created one of the most beloved love stories in film history. When The Way We Were premiered, audiences wept. They saw something raw, the ache of two people who loved deeply but could never stay together. Behind the scenes, the same truth lingered. Barbra and Robert admired each other deeply, but they lived in different worlds. Hers filled with energy and ambition, his craving quiet and simplicity. Years later, Barbra would confess, "I had such a crush on him. I loved the way he looked at me when the cameras weren't rolling." And Redford, in his typical understated way, admitted, "We both knew it was special, but some things are better left as they are, perfect, untouched." They never had an affair, but the emotional intimacy between them was undeniable. The connection was electric, yet delicate, a relationship that existed somewhere between fantasy and memory. Nearly 30 years later, when Barbra called him about making a sequel, he politely declined. He told her, "Katie and Hubble are better frozen in time. Let's not touch what worked." Still, when asked about her decades later, Redford smiled, that same quiet, knowing smile, and said, "Barbra was unforgettable. She knew how to challenge me, how to make me laugh, and how to break my heart, all in one scene." Their story was never meant to have an ending. It existed for 2 hours on film and a lifetime in memory. And perhaps that's why it remains so powerful, because it captures something we all understand, the love that could have been.
By the time Robert Redford crossed paths with Meryl Streep, he was already a Hollywood legend, a man who had lived through the storms of fame, love, and loss. And Meryl, by then, was becoming one of the most respected actresses of her generation, intelligent, intuitive, and hauntingly graceful. They met not through romance, but through art, drawn together by mutual admiration and an almost spiritual understanding of each other's craft. They never worked together on screen, though many had wished they would. For years, directors dreamed of pairing them. Redford and Streep, two titans of subtlety, two masters of emotion. But fate had other plans. They came close once. She was considered for Out of Africa, 1985, the role that eventually went to Meryl herself. The irony was poetic. Redford's most romantic film ended up being the one that forever linked their names, even though their connection remained just beyond reach. When asked about her years later, Redford smiled thoughtfully and said, "Meryl, she's like a mountain. You don't conquer her, you just stand in awe." Meryl once said in an interview, "Bob represents a kind of strength that's disappearing, quiet, grounded, real. He listens more than he speaks." It wasn't love in the traditional sense. No scandal, no whispers. It was something purer, respect, admiration, and a deep, unspoken kinship between two artists who understood the loneliness of their profession. When they finally appeared together, decades later, at an awards tribute, the crowd erupted in applause before they even spoke. Standing side by side, their chemistry was undeniable. Not romantic, but profound. Two souls who had walked parallel paths for half a century, finally sharing the same stage. Redford, now gray-haired and reflective, turned to her and said quietly, "You make everything look effortless, but I know the cost behind that." And she smiled, her eyes soft with recognition, the kind that only another artist could understand. Their connection was a reminder that not all great love stories involve romance. Some are made of something quieter, mutual respect, artistic trust, and the rare comfort of being understood. For Robert Redford and Meryl Streep, it was never about what happened between them. It was about what could have happened, and the beauty of knowing it didn't have to still mean everything.
After decades of passion, fame, and loss, Robert Redford finally found peace in the quiet presence of one woman, Sibylle Szaggars. Unlike the stars and legends who came before, Sibylle was not part of Hollywood. She was an artist, a painter from Germany, with a soul as patient as the mountains she loved to paint. They met in the 1990s, long after Redford had stopped chasing fame. He was older, wiser, weary of interviews and camera flashes. She was calm, grounded, the kind of woman who didn't care who he was, only who he was when the world went silent. At first, few understood their connection. She was 20 years younger, a European free spirit.
He was America's most private movie star. But to Redford, that difference didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply at peace. Sibylle didn't try to change him, nor did she worship him. She shared his love for nature, solitude, and art. They spent days painting side by side in their ranch in Sundance, surrounded by trees and silence. For a man who had lived most of his life in front of millions, this, the quiet, the stillness, was his salvation. They married in 2009, after nearly 2 decades together. It wasn't a Hollywood event. No reporters, no red carpet, just family and friends under the soft Utah sky. When asked why he waited so long to remarry, Redford smiled and said, "Because for once, I wanted to be sure." In Sibylle, he found not the thrill of passion, but the comfort of understanding. She brought him balance, the still water after years of waves. She once said in an interview, "Bob has an old soul. He doesn't speak much, but when he does, it comes from a deep place." Together they embraced a slower rhythm of life, painting, traveling, and working quietly for environmental causes. For Redford, it was a return to the simplicity he had been searching for since his youth. Those close to him say she became his anchor. And when he was asked about love in his later years, he replied softly, "It's not about falling anymore. It's about staying." And she stayed. Sibylle Szaggars didn't arrive at the beginning of his story. She came at the right time, when the noise had faded, when all that was left was truth. For Robert Redford, she was not another chapter. She was the epilogue, the peace that comes after the storm.
At 89, Robert Redford no longer talks about fame, awards, or the movies that made him a legend. When he speaks now, it's softer, measured, reflective, as if each word carries the weight of a lifetime. He's not the Sundance Kid anymore. He's a man who has seen how love changes shape, how it grows, fades, and sometimes returns when you least expect it. The 6 women who passed through his life were not just names, they were seasons. Each brought their own light, their own lesson. Lola Van Wagenen, the quiet foundation of his youth. Natalie Wood, the fire that awakened his artistic soul. Fonda, the mirror who challenged him to evolve. Barbra Streisand, the spark of what could have been. Meryl Streep, the connection that transcended romance. And Sibylle Szaggars, the stillness that stayed when everything else faded. He once said, "I don't think love ever disappears. It just changes form. Sometimes it becomes memory, sometimes friendship, sometimes art." For Redford, love was never about possession. It was about presence. It was about the moments that stayed long after the people had gone. He carried each of these women with him, not as regrets, but as reminders of how deeply he had lived. In one of his last public interviews, he smiled when asked if he believed in soulmates. "I think we meet many," he said, "but only a few stay with us forever, even if they're not here anymore." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, but there was peace in it, because the truth is, Redford never stopped believing in love. Not the cinematic kind, but the kind that hums quietly beneath the noise of life, the kind that leaves you changed. He once described it best, years ago. You spend your life chasing meaning. Then one day, you realize meaning was in the people you loved. Now, in the quiet light of Utah's mountains, Robert Redford paints, writes, and walks under the open sky with Sibylle. There are no cameras, no scripts, no retakes, just time. And in that time, he has found what all his characters were always searching for: peace. The legend may fade, but the man remains. And his story, like the 6 women who shaped it, reminds us that love, in all its forms,
is what truly endures. Because in the end, Robert Redford's greatest masterpiece was not a film, it was his heart.
If you believe the legends of Hollywood should never be forgotten, show some love by liking, commenting, and subscribing to Screen Icons. Every click helps us honor the stars who changed film forever.